So, everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Zach. I am from the Debt Review Awards team, and it's very nice to have you with us. Yeah, I'm also from the Debt Free Magazine team. So, if you don't read Debt Free yet, please do. And we're just talking about what lies ahead for the coming months. In fact, you've probably already received one or two peer reviews this year since the awards event. Because once the kind of event happens, we kind of reset and start running again. But this is just a discussion about some of the criteria that gets used in the peer reviews, how that works. We'll give a little bit of an overview about how the peer reviews work. And then we'll go into the specific things that are used in the peer review process. We'll kind of focus in on four different peer reviews. One will be about debt counselors. One will be about credit providers. We'll keep it pretty general. One will be about the attorneys, and one will be about the credit bureaus. This is the new category that we're working in this year. So that'll be the kind of topics for discussion today. And basically, we want to just run through the kind of more advanced stages of the peer review process. So I'll show you at the beginning how we do stuff, and it's very simple at the beginning, but it gets more and more complex as time goes by. So let me just make myself a little bit smaller, get out the way here. Hopefully you see me as a floating head at the moment. All right, so we're talking about the criteria. So probably the first question that we get asked the most about the Debt Review Awards is, well, who gets to participate? And very simply put, if you are registered with the National Credit Regulator as a payment distribution agent, as a credit provider, as a debt counselor, or as a credit bureau, not ADRAs at this point, but if you're registered on that database, then you can participate and people can and will be talking about you. So you don't actually need to actively do anything to be considered. By simply being registered with the NCR, that is our source of participants. That is the source of who gets involved in the process. How does that happen? Well, essentially, we take the email addresses that are on that database and we then communicate with those email addresses, sending out links to complete online peer reviews. Now, having said that, I know that not everyone is entirely satisfied with the information that's on that database. Okay, that we know. But those are the addresses we use, especially at first during the year. So our year runs from just after the awards in October, so November, December now. We run right again to the month before the Debt Review Awards. So we send an email to those addresses and we say, here's a link. You click the link and it takes you to an online web page. And the web page is essentially like a survey or a peer review, and you get to click some buttons or type in some information. We also do reach out to people in other ways. So later in the year, as we get more and more detailed about things, we tend to talk to the associations at some point. So at some point, you might get maybe if you're a member of formerly the MFSA and now you're a member of CASA, you'll get an email from them to say, hey, would you like to participate in this debt review peer review? That happens, later in the year. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to reach people. We do use the NCR's database because that's where the registrants come from. But later in the process, we are cognizant of the fact that maybe those email addresses are not necessarily correct, or they're outdated, or they might be very general email addresses. So it may be going to an admin address or something, and that's not ideal for you. So we do have our own database, but we start with the NCR's database and later in the year. So sometimes you might notice you might have a year where you didn't get a lot of contact. It may be that the information on the NCR's database is not really up to date, or it's a general email address like admin, webmaster, inbox, something like that, info at your address. Then later in the year, you may specifically get a message from me saying, hey, do you want to participate? Because we try to go through the list and just see have we given everybody a chance? So we do that through the associations and through a database of emails that we have accumulated over the years of people signing in to do it and saying, use this address. This is my best favorite address. If that has changed, that's also maybe a reason why you may not get an email, because you may be getting it to the old email address. Because you have specifically at some point in time told us, no, use Zak at, you know, I don't know, at monkeytown.com. So maybe that's the reason. It may still be going to that address. So every now and then, if we have a call during the year to say, would you like to update your details? You may also get access through that to that, and you can update your details. Right. Let's talk a little bit about sorting. So at the beginning of the year, there's thousands of participants. I think if you go to the NCR's database, you'll see there are thousands and thousands of credit providers and debt counselors. And we know that not everybody on those lists is either practicing or is practicing a lot. So you may have a credit provider who's registered and they have 10 clients. You may have a debt counselor who's registered, but they haven't actually taken on any new clients. They're just sitting with a few clients and they're not actively kind of participating in the industry. Or you may have people who qualify and they do the qualification, they register, and they don't have any clients at all. So that is possible as well. So what we do is we ask different industry role players, should we be talking about these people? And how that breaks down is we normally send out a series where we ask, firstly, this question. Just tell us briefly, this company or this debt counseling practice, this credit provider, are they good, average, or bad? And we ask that. It's a very simple question, and we ask a lot of people the same question. And then we take those that get a lot of ratings that say good and average, and we do it again. So then we ask again, are they good, average, or bad? And after we do this process a few times, it really takes a pool of thousands of people down to a smaller pool of hundreds of people. So you'll find perhaps amongst the debt counselors, instead of there being 1,700 people or 1,900 people or 2,000 people that we're talking about, it might even take us down to a pool of about 700 people who are actively involved in the industry. And that's a much easier place for us to start from. And I'd like to just send a shout out to some of the associations for their help in helping us do that. It's better, right? It means that you don't necessarily end up reviewing a very small credit provider that you've never dealt with whatsoever, and you've never heard of, and they only have 2 clients because they registered with the NCR because they've been very law-abiding citizens. Okay, so if that makes sense so far, can I get a thumbs up from the audience? You understand that kind of concept. We take it from very wide, thousands of credit providers down to a smaller pool. All right, thank you, everybody. We also have some ancillary data that we get courtesy of the payment distribution agents and some of the credit provider associations, that these people are more active in the industry than others. And that's a supplementary thing we've got kind of going in the background, just so that we don't ask debt counselors, for instance, about people who are not practicing as credit providers, or credit providers about debt counselors who are not active in the industry at the moment. So that also does happen kind of in the background, parallel to the system. Right. So once we have a pool of people who are active in the industry, now we've got to start to figure out, okay, should we be talking about them? We look at the ones that have a lot of ratings that say these are good debt counselors, right? Or these are good credit providers. Also, even if you badmouth some of the biggest credit providers, let's say everybody says, no, we don't like this big bank, we're still going to end up talking about the big bank. We have a list of kind of very specific ones that over the years have been done. There's a bit of fail safe there. But then you're welcome to go and review them and say they're not doing great. That's also helpful. All right. So we send out peer reviews and you click on a link, you go to it, and it asks you a few questions. Now, I just want to make a note that's just to say that sometimes the questions will look slightly different. And that's because when you average things out over a very large population group, it is better to change the phrasing slightly every time, so that words aren't exactly the same. But we do tend to keep the wording quite similar. The meaning is the same. So you might say, is someone speedy or is someone quick? The wording is maybe slightly different, but it might mean the same thing. So we kind of use that kind of thing during the peer review process. It's just a good practice for when you're doing surveys. Right. So let's talk about debt counselors as our first category. So once we've got an idea of who the better and active debt counselors are, we start to ask the credit providers more and more information about you. And ultimately, once we go through a few hoops and we get down to maybe a smaller group of 200, 250 debt counselors, 300 debt counselors, we start to ask these kind of questions of the credit providers about you. Now, we may ask them one at a time. We may ask five at a time. We may ask 10 at a time. The system kind of starts doing random stuff where it starts mixing it. We know that some participants know you, and so they can talk about you. So if they know you, they can rate some information about you. The computer's quite smart in the background, and it mixes and matches and does this. Right. So, for instance, our first question here that might be asked, and once again, the phrasing may change ever so slightly, but it asks about when you promise to pay something, do your clients actually end up paying that thing? Now, credit providers are very interested in this because they track this information, and when you fall outside of these, a certain tolerance, they start to send you, for instance, letters to say, "Hey, we might want to kick your client out of the process here because they're not actually paying enough." So they track this sort of information. It's important to them, and of course, it's important to us. Are our clients? Are we actually moving them through the process, and they are paying what they said they were going to pay? So that's one of the things we ask. Another thing we ask is when people sign up for the process and they come into the process on the credit provider side, do they see those people going through the process or immediately dropping off? Now, we know drop off is a big thing in our industry. And so this is quite a nice way for the credit providers to give some feedback to also track this. There are other ways to track this information, and we are talking to the PDAs about whether they would be willing to share this information, and we would then ask you to participate, whether you would be willing to track that as well. But essentially, if a debt counselor is bringing in 1,000 clients a month, but only 10 of them actually go a couple of months down the line, well, that's a very telling kind of story. So what this helps do is just identify those who bring in clients and take them through the journey. There's always going to be some drop off, but this is looking at, is there a big thing by month 3 that people have dropped off? Right. Next category that we would, or criteria we would ask them about is when you're getting proposals, are you getting rubbish? So we ask them this in slightly different ways, but we ask them about the quality of the proposals they're getting. Are they reasonable, unreasonable? Are they getting something that they can work with? They track this. Right. Another thing that we ask about is when a credit provider has a query of a debt counselor, how quickly or what is the speed of the turnaround? And also we ask a little bit about, do you resolve the queries? So it might be one of 3 different ways to ask this question. But we're asking about how long does it take you to sort stuff out? So if it's taking months, that's not great. If it's a faster time period, that's pretty good. So you can see the importance of that. Right. Then because we have an industry where we need to communicate well with each other, we review this. Okay. And we now ask, okay, well, when you're talking to this debt counselor or their staff, so that it may be smaller debt counselors, we tend to ask the question about them. And in a larger debt counseling practice, we tend to ask about the staff because we kind of know the categories that people fall into. We ask, okay, when you communicate with them, are they respectful? Is it easy to understand them? So essentially, we're asking about the communication skills. Right. Next, we ask a little bit about knowledge of the process. So when a credit provider is dealing with a person, are they educated about the process? Do they know nothing about the process in one simple thing? That they only do that and they have no understanding of the process? The debt counselor, are they argumentative about a thing for no apparent reason when it's obviously not part of the NCA? That sort of stuff. So there's different ways to ask this question, but once again, it comes down to, does the debt counselor or the staff member understand their part of the process, where they are, especially when dealing with queries or complaints as well. So you'll see there's a little bit about that. Industry timelines. This is one that's often tracked on systems that credit providers can give us feedback pretty quickly. They're expecting certain documents within a certain amount of time. Do they get it within that time? It's nice for them. They can measure it quite easily. All right, and then we have an optional question. Some debt counselors do use DCRS, others don't. So this kind of falls under the optional stuff. It's interesting to get feedback on this, whether it gets used in the peer review process for the results or not. DCRS use, obviously, there's a big push amongst certain parties to get it used. If you're not using it, try it out. Just to see kind of what's happening on that side. And if you haven't used it, BASA very much want you to use it. Try it out. Some systems automatically run it as your first calculation right now. So you probably are using it. All right. So moving back away from the optional stuff, back into the kind of required stuff. This is more of a, are you being treated fairly question? So debt counselors, we can fall into the trap of fighting very hard for the consumer and overlooking their shortcomings and only focusing on the credit provider side. This is a way for a credit provider to kind of give some feedback on that. Obviously, they understand we're coming from the consumer's viewpoint, and we're going to be pursuing that. So they start with that viewpoint across all debt counselors, but some they're going to be able to say, okay, something is wrong here. There's a problem here. Something weird is happening here. This gives them an opportunity to point it out. That if something is like, if you're getting proposals for R1 on a home loan or something like that, something is wrong. Here's an interesting one. We ask the credit providers, is the debt counselor they're working with trying to improve things? So a bit of subjective here. And this is normally reserved for kind of really late in the process where we're talking to senior managers amongst the credit provider staff, because they see the interactions that happen between people. And obviously, as a smaller debt counselor, you may have a limited scale at this, but also the other smaller debt counselors that they're looking at may also have a smaller role. So it keeps it kind of aligned. Nobody's getting preference because of that, if that makes sense. Okay. We asked this question in a number of different ways, but it comes down to how the debt counselor runs their business. The debt counseling is a mandatory, we have things we have to do, but then in terms of business, we could be running a very smooth business. We could be running a dodgy business. We could be running a business that's very kind of like consumer focused, or we're taking the money and we're running away. This gives the credit provider an opportunity to identify any problem areas once again, where they can say, here's someone who maybe they signing up people and tricking them into debt review, right? Because we get all the complaints immediately and stuff. They can pick it up. Or if they're seeing weird fees and things happening, they can pick it up. In many cases, that's the case. So it gives them an opportunity to give some feedback on that. And then one of the things that we, credit providers are very, very interested in, do the matters go to court? Do the matters go to the tribunal? We ask a few questions about this. We ask for ratings, we ask for rankings, we ask for feedback. Are they getting feedback from you about court matters? So we ask this in a few different ways, but this is perhaps the most common way. We ask for a rating of either very good or very bad, and they're able kind of on a temperature scale to say, hey, you're very good at this thing, or hey, you're very bad at this thing. Because obviously, as per requirements to do with the Act, we want to see these matters going to court, and the credit providers like the clarity that comes from that as well. So they like to know it's happening, they like to see it's happening, they like to get the information so that they can load stuff onto their systems, for instance. So one of the things that the credit providers track. All right, so we're going to stop there for debt counselors at the moment. If you are a debt counselor or a credit provider and you want to comment something about that, please use the chat function. Put some comments in there right now, and we can come back to it later so that we don't forget them. If you have any questions about some of the stuff that we've looked at so long, please do put a comment in the chat. Okay. I'm just checking the chat myself. Yeah, Antonio's having a good laugh about a lot of stuff there. It's good, Antonio. Okay, but the credit providers are looking at these things. All right. Credit providers, you might be interested to hear what the debt counselors get asked about yourselves. So once again, we do the same kind of sorting process. Should we be talking about these people? Do you know about these people that the computer kind of remembers in the background? And then we start to say, all right, let's group different types of credit providers together and start asking questions in groups about credit providers. And there's a lot of crossover amongst the credit providers. For instance, you may have a credit provider who provides home loans, but they also provide short-term loans. So there is quite a lot of crossover here, and the computer does a lot of work in the background. There are a lot of credit providers. So once we've got it down to manageable size, we then start to ask more and more detailed questions. And throughout the year, in different quarters, we'll ask debt counselors. We'll try to average out the number, just so credit providers know. We try to get an even amount of people talking about you and someone like you, and someone else like you, and someone else like you. We try to get that number very similar, just for comparative purposes when we're doing rankings. Okay. First thing we like to ask debt counselors when they start doing the peer reviews is we just ask them to rank you and people similar to you. And we ask them, well, who's the best out of this bunch? It's a market research kind of trick that we've learned over the years. We don't really use that information, but it is interesting to ask people their general impression of you. Sometimes we ask this up front, sometimes we ask it right at the end. Just for our own interest and yours, what we often do is we then go and compare the actual results. If you compare step by step by step by step by step, how people rate you to their impression of you, and see whether that's the same or is there a big disconnect. Sometimes your reputation can help you. And so actually in people's minds, they rank you very highly. But when they go and look at you step by step, they might say, oh, okay, I'm finding problems here. It's just an interesting way to see if there's a disconnect between reputational and kind of actual everyday practice. So it's one of those things that, once again, it's optional. It's not a thing that we use in the actual reviews to produce a result, but it is there in the process. We also ask a little bit about some of the mandatory things you have to do, like providing information. So for instance, COBs, it's a very classic one. We just ask, are you doing it? Hopefully by now. I see I took this one from the non-bank ones, but for the banking ones, the same. So we ask a little bit about that. We also ask about how you, as an institution, are treating your clients once they begin the process. So this is a big thing for debt counselors. They want to see that if a client has entered debt review, your organization as a whole backs up and lets us deal with them as debt counselors, gets them ready for the process, and then puts them in. If somebody's still phoning, or even months later, still phoning and asking for money, this is where this information will come through, which is helpful to credit providers so that they can maybe, if they get some sort of reporting on this, they might know, hey, something's going on. But it is important for us debt counselors. We don't like to see the consumers getting pestered because it erodes their confidence in the process. And they drop out of the process because they simply got a phone call from someone saying, hey, I want money. It's big for us. All right. Then we've got here a section where we'll ask about, do you cancel debit orders? How is that done? Maybe different ways of doing this. Is it easy to do? Do you do it timeously? Do we have problems with this? So there might be different ways of asking this, but it's about debit orders. Do they get sorted out, or do they still hit within, a reasonable time, and then they still hit? Okay. Something else we ask then is just about timelines. So once again, various phrasing on this. Do you do things within a set amount of time as we would expect you to do? And most credit providers, I just like to say, in the reviews, all score quite highly in these kind of obvious things. They score quite highly. As a rule, credit providers are doing better than they've ever done before. All right. We also talk about counter proposals. So as a debt counselor, you anticipate some counter proposals. Totally reasonable. You're going to get counter proposals, right? You can't get away from that. We understand that. But are they reasonable? So that's the question. If we might ask this in different ways, but the words like unreasonable, frivolous, unnecessary, we'll be using these words to ask about them. If you're having a high incidence of counter proposals, it will hurt you this year with the process. It's just, even if you do feel it's genuinely warranted, we asking the debt counselors if they feel it's genuinely warranted. So it is an interesting distinction to make. You might think look, we have to do this. And the debt counselor might think, no, you didn't have to do this. And that's where you would pick that up. All right, then DCRS, credit providers in general amongst the banks, and in those categories, this would be an obligatory question. Amongst the smaller credit providers, not so much, because they didn't sign that thing. Right, so this is about, do you accept DCRS proposals, or are you kicking out lots of counter proposals? We include this. There's different ways of phrasing it once again, but is it done? Or do you kick out lots of counter proposals? We'll also ask a little bit about, do you oppose matters at court unnecessarily? So once again, as mentioned, we anticipate as debt counselors, there's going to be things at court that we have to sort out. Fine, we accept that. But is it necessary or unnecessary? Is it done as some sort of strategy for negotiating for more money? And is it done to specifically cause problems for the consumers? This is where we would pick that up, and the debt counsel would get some feedback on that. And then we have two sections that are quite similar, but there's a distinction. These two sections here. So we ask firstly a little bit about when people have just queries. We're trying to get information from you. How quickly does that happen? Do we get the information we need? We might ask it in slightly different ways. And then also with complaints, specifically complaints, when we have a problem, is it resolved? How quickly does it get resolved? How good is the communication about that? They are similar, but we distinguish between them because a query is not necessarily a bad thing. A complaint is more a bad thing. So just drawing a little bit of a line between that and how quickly does it get sorted out. All right. And then once again, talking about staff, a lot of credit providers are obviously dealing with a lot with call center staff. There's also some portals and things, but when we talk to human beings, how do they respond? Do they know what they're talking about? What is their communication like? So it's very similar to the question that debt counselors have. It's just slightly different phrasing, and it is broken up into two main ideas. Do people know what they're talking about, and how do they talk about it? So that information would feed into the same kind of category. And then end of process stuff. So paid up letters, imbalance differences, sorting things out, getting stuff cleared off your accounts. Is that end of kind of process stuff sorted? There's some new phrasing that's coming in connection with this on one of the questions, but essentially it's about what happens when we get to the end of the process. All right, so credit providers, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat if you want to talk about some of those things. But just to reiterate, it would be a smaller pool that we go into these deeper things about. Early in the process, we're just asking, should we be talking about this person? Do you know who they are? And then later we ask a little bit, are they average? Are they good? Are they bad? And then later in the process, we say, are they average? Or are they really good? Are they very good? And then we start to talk about them in more and more detail. And maybe a few of these questions, or maybe a lot of these questions, all getting asked. And we ask them about different account types. So you might, as a debt counselor, you might be asked about, a bank in several of these categories. You may get a review about it. It's because they might offer several types of credit. Okay. Somebody was asking a little bit about attorneys. Let's talk about attorneys. So in the attorneys category, we ask attorneys to talk about attorneys. So we don't ask debt counselors and we don't ask credit providers to talk about attorneys because they are your clients, and your clients, we don't ask the consumers to talk about their banks, and we don't ask the consumers to talk about their debt counselors. We ask your peers in the industry to talk about you. So that's because if you think about an attorney who's representing a credit provider, when they come up in a case and they see an attorney who's dealing for the debt counselor, they have an understanding of what it's like to work with that person. It is a smaller pool of candidates. You kind of know each other. Some have quite a strong reputation. And this is just the way that we can get someone who's like you, who understands the process, to give feedback about the process. So it cuts down on impressions. So for instance, if we ask a debt counselor about a credit provider's attorney, they might say bad things about them simply because they're in an antagonistic role, and maybe in that one case, something bad happened. Attorneys, I think if you deal with an attorney from either the credit provider or the debt counselor, you understand the role they play. So it just provides better quality feedback But it is a smaller pool. We're not talking about thousands of people here. We're talking about a few practices. And within those practices, you have some attorneys in particular who specialize in the debt review matters. So over time, it's taken us about 2.5 years. We're growing the list of people who are involved here. And that's why last year we handed out an award for the first time. The year before, we didn't hand out an award. We handed out a certificate because we were a bit cautious that we had enough information. But it's getting there. We're getting more and more participants. And I think over time, we're going to be able to drill down into the very nitty gritty like we do with the debt counselors and stuff. But for now, we're keeping it quite high level. And over time, we're going to be able to go deeper and deeper. And if you are an attorney that's here today, please make suggestions to us on some specific things that you are able to measure. So we always like to make essentially a system where you have about 80% of things you can specifically measure, and 20% of stuff that's a little bit of a judgment call. That kind of often helps just distinguish someone who's doing from okay to doing great. Right, so attorneys talking about each other. One of the things we ask in a number of different ways is about the professionalism of the attorney themselves or their staff members. So we might ask about the staff members when you communicate with them. How well do they communicate? We might ask about the attorney coming to court. Are they prepared? Do they know the matters? Do you end up going to court and they're wasting time? Right? Do they know the actual debt review process? And do they know the facts of the matter? There's different ways we ask the thing, but essentially we're kind of going to the sort of when they show up at court or when you're dealing with them as an institution or as an organizational company practice, are they professional? Then we ask for a little bit of ratings about negotiations. So this doesn't always happen. You don't always have a negotiative process, but when you do negotiate a little bit, what's that interaction like? Once again, I think attorneys understand that you're representing your clients, so there's a bit of an understanding about that, whereas maybe a debt counselor or a credit provider might feel a little antagonistic. I think you guys know what you're doing. And then also we have the same thing about queries. We separate our queries. You're trying to get some information from an attorney. How long does it take you? Do you get it? Do you get the documents you need? Do you get the information you need? How speedily does that happen? What's the response times? There might be different phrasing, but it means the same thing. And then finally, a little bit about the attorney as a person. Are they approachable? Can you actually speak to this person? Are they reasonable? Are they approachable? So thanks for putting some comments in there. We'll definitely have a look at them. Once again, what it does is the system works on a percentage basis. So it doesn't necessarily work on an incidence basis. So if 100 people have to say something, it doesn't prejudice the person who doesn't get 100 comments, if that makes sense. Because 100 people may make a comment and say, oh, we have a very big problem here. But the other person may just get a rating that just says, no, they're a bad person. The system works out whether that is a trend or not. And the system is quite smart at working it out as a percentage. So for instance, we could even compare a small debt counseling practice to a ginormous debt counseling practice. In theory, even though their client numbers are different and things, we don't like to do it. But in theory, you could, because if a debt counselor has 10 consumers that are their clients, or a debt counselor has 100, there is a percentage basis of what's happening there. And the system can work out the percentages of incidents. But with the attorneys, like I said, it's quite a small pool. So we kind of just keeping it fairly simple for now. But thank you very much for the suggestions. We'll as a group, we're going to discuss them. All right. A new category that we're working on this year is credit bureaus. We won't be handing out an award in this category. We will be handing out a certificate of recognition. And that's because we're still figuring out exactly how we're going to measure these things. So you will get a lot of these questions maybe in peer reviews, and it will be about the credit bureau that you deal with. So this is very similar to the PDAs. We only ever ask about the PDAs that you deal with, right? Because we can't ask you about someone you have no experience with. And then once again, as mentioned earlier, we do percentages. So we say, look, if 90% of the people who deal with this credit bureau have a problem with it, and we compare it to the other credit bureau, and they've got only 10% of the people that deal with them have a problem with it, that may indicate that that credit provider is doing a better job somehow, right? And some of the things that we'll be looking at, and this was discussed, yeah, and if you are using more than one credit bureau, as was mentioned, you will probably get asked about more than one, and we will ask you to self-identify in the process during the peer reviews, other peer reviews about other things. We'll ask you, oh, which credit bureau do you use? And that'll go into the computer. The computer will then say, oh, this debt counselor knows about that credit bureau. So we do it with the PDAs too. We kind of ask, oh, which PDAs do you use? And then we'll only ask you about that PDA. We won't ask you about another PDA. Once again, also for PDAs, multiple people use, multiple PDAs. But we'll discuss PDAs in a moment. So going back to the kind of questions, we'll talk about what's actually on the report. Does it have what you're looking for? So as a debt counselor, we're looking for particular things. As a credit provider, you're looking for particular things. We're going to be focusing on the debt counselors for starters, and we'll see during the year how the rollout goes. We'll be talking about the pricing. Is it reasonable? We'll be talking about how quickly, if you're dealing with kind of drawing a report, but other matters, how quickly do they resolve stuff? Queries. Now, this is an interesting one because the queries would be kind of consumer queries that you might handle on their behalf. We'll check the phrasing on it, but are they sorting it out quickly and giving you responses quickly about it? And then another way of kind of asking the same things about things as a credit provider, are they giving you as a debt counselor, are they giving you what you need? Or is a credit provider giving you what you need? One of the minor things that we'll look for, and we do a thing called weighting. Does this credit bureau offer integration? So it won't be very strongly weighted. It'll just be a little percentage that might get added to the overall results. And then just out of curiosity, so that we can give some feedback to the credit bureaus in general. So we'd never give it about individual responses, but we'll just say, is it working? We like to give people some feedback so they know where the stuff is working on. All right. Billing, is it easy to kind of sort out your billing with the credit bureau or not? Is it complicated? Is it easy? We'll also look at, and this is probably it's a very similar question. Often there's two questions that mean the same thing. Is the information up to date? Is it complete? And with new requirements from the NCR, this is probably going to become more relevant. Are we seeing the proper information here? Once again, a similar thing to what we've seen before. If you have a complaint, how quickly is it resolved? Here's the one that we might give minor weighting to as well. Small split percentages. Does the credit bureau educate people about debt review? Now, obviously, if you sign up to become a credit bureau, that is not necessarily one of the things that you are required to do by law. So this is a nice to have. And that's why we would add it as a soft thing on the side, that if we end up with two credit bureaus with very similar results, we're then able to go look into these minor things that might just bump one higher than the other. So this is probably only going to be used if that situation happens. And it does happen. So for instance, just to let you know, for instance, in the debt review side with maybe credit providers, sometimes there's a few of the vehicle people who have very similar results. They are quite similar. And then it would be like these small little optional things that might just you go look at what 1,000 people said on the small optional things, and it might just give you a little bit of an indication, slight leaning this year between one or the other. All right. Here's an interesting one that was suggested at the discussion about this at the DC and CP meetup and intuitive discussion. Do you feel the credit bureau is only giving the right people information? So there is some concern in the industry that where is the information coming from? Is data going to the wrong people? We may be able to gather some information here. We're not quite sure about its inclusion and weighting yet. There is some discussion, and we're going to be talking to the credit bureaus specifically about how they would like this weighted or not. Right. And then industry participation. It's also, once again, a nice to have. Are they involved? Are they do we have any interaction with them? And then small thing with minor weighting might be, do they offer like all the bells and whistles? Is it fancy or is it very plain? Is it very simple, or is it kind of like got a lot of options for you? and we'll ask this in a few different ways, but is it being also tailored for debt review? So as debt counselors, for instance, is this useful for you? So that would be a debt counselor oriented question. All right, so if you are a credit bureau and you're here today, feel free to drop some questions in the chat. Please do. Over time, we will refine which one of these are the main questions. We will probably drop some of these questions. By the time we get to the award stage, we will probably include some new questions. But this is the pool of questions that will be used at first. And we will try to ensure that the same questions are asked of equal amounts of people so that you have equal amounts of feedback. And that will be an equal amount of large debt counselors, equal amount of small debt counselors, equal amount of medium debt counselors. There's a lot of moving parts in the background. Okay. Just looking ahead from our side as the organizers, our plans for what's coming this year. As mentioned, we are very eager to include credit bureaus in some way into the process. We think they play an important part. We just want to find nice, measurable ways where we can give reliable feedback and that it's fair to the credit bureaus. We don't want one credit bureau simply getting all the ratings because more debt counselors use that, right? So that would be a bit unfair. We had this challenge when we worked with the PDAs. We had to figure out the ways to kind of make sure that it was percentage based because some PDAs have more clients than others. We had to figure out how to do that. We're using the same principles as we did with the PDAs for credit bureaus. In terms of PDAs, the PDAs, you'll notice in 2025, we recognized all 3 PDAs. The pool of participants is a bit small. So after discussion with them, I think we can all acknowledge that they all do a bloody good job. You know, they're all doing a very hard job, moving a lot of money for a lot of people for very little money. And so a decision was made also in conjunction with them that we would recognize all 3 rather than identify one as being better than the others because we think it's a fair thing. We have also asked the PDAs, and we are going to be communicating with you about the level of data that they're able to provide. So it's kind of interesting. They have a lot of data, and as organizers, we would love them to be sharing that data with the industry. So not about you specifically as a credit provider or you specifically as a debt counselor. We would like to see the PDA sharing as much information as they can, either with the regulator, which they kind of do on a regular basis, but also with the public, so we can see trends within the industry that they already know. And we think that would be beneficial to everybody. So we're trying to see if we can work with them towards that goal. And if that information that gets shared could become some sort of benchmark that we would use to help quickly distinguish debt counselors that should be talked about or not. So if somebody is drastically underperforming in regard to that information, we would know, okay, don't spend a lot of time asking the credit providers about that, because the credit providers, although we ask multiple staff members within the same organizations, towards the end of the process, we really are talking to like the heads of department. These are the people who spend, we can't keep them for weeks and weeks and weeks talking about debt counselors, each individual one. We have to give them a very reasonable pool of people to go through. And so we're trying to see if we could work with the PDAs closer to use standardized data as a way of helping identify that. We also want to do it in such a way that it doesn't prejudice people who don't work too closely with PDAs, because there are some debt counselors where that's still the case. In fact, legally, as a debt counselor, you only need to receive payment from your clients through a PDA if you have signed the new terms and conditions of registration. You don't have to use a PDA for any other purpose. So you can sit with an Excel spreadsheet and a calculator if you want to. We have to always just be cognizant of that, things like that. But we are looking at ways we can work closer with the PDAs, and we're really looking forward to that. And we will share that along the way. We've already done some soft testing on some of this, very soft testing on it. So, all right. And then I think I just want to open it to everybody just to say, we want to improve. how do we do that? You tell us how we improve. So how could we improve? Please give it some thought. Maybe this is not the forum to discuss it in massive detail, but if you receive a peer review that asks that, please do spend some time to give us some feedback. We very seriously go through every recommendation. If you say go to KZN, we will go to KZN. If you say, hey, can we have credit bureaus? We will start to work towards credit bureaus. If you say, hey, we want to talk about this at the debt counselors or this at the credit providers, we will look at it. And so we will also then provide feedback to the industry to say, hey, this is what we're starting to work with. And because of the nature of the process, we don't instantly always include something immediately, but we will add it into a long list of like a wish list, and we slowly work our way through it. So this year we are doing stuff that maybe people suggested 4 years ago because it takes time. We'd rather be cautious in implementing stuff than break something by moving too swiftly. But we are trying to include every suggestion that we get. Like if we can, we will do it if it doesn't break the thing. So please, by all means, do. And right now in the chat, thank you for leaving some comments. If you've got more comments or you want to just talk now, by all means, do. I'm in fact going to stop screen share here. Let's just see. Okay. All right. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the recording for now. So if you're happy with that, thank you for joining us, everybody. You don't have to leave, but I am going to stop the recording. So that just gives us an overview of what we're talking about each year in regard to it. So let me just stop here. Thank you, everybody.